Hello, my name is John Peace with the Rural Route newsletter, and I'm here with my co-host, Sara-June with the Neighborly newspaper.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on the show again today. Appreciate it. And yep,
Wonderful.
I'm putting out a new news platform in Southwest Virginia called The Neighborly, and you can find it at www.swvacountry.com. And today we're talking about emergency responders and the 911 system, and we're kind of doing a look back at the history and some of the stories of what's happening in rural areas when we have emergencies, what that looked like before 911 and our EMT systems, and what it looks like today. So, John, we were talking about what things happened in rural areas, in agriculture, farming, in coal country,
Oh, yeah.
when before you have phones, or you might have a phone, you might have a CB radio, but you do not have the 911 system that we have today. What's your track record on that, John?
Oh, well, trust me, I'll show my age. I well remember life before 911 addresses. This is a little off topic or off subject, but we'll get back around to it. I was a sales rep back in the 90s, and I called on big farms before 911 addresses. The only way you could find people was you turned right at the little white church out in the country by the big oak tree or near the stock tank. And so that was how it was before phones, before Google Maps. And
Yes.
yeah, and also talk about before 911, it just came to me and stuff was like even my newsletters called the Rural Route newsletter. And my daughter asked me, "What's Rural Route?" And see, I grew up and you grew up where my home address was Rural Route 1, Box 926. I can remember that like yesterday. And of course, now it's 2-3 something Clinch Haven Road, and we got the 911 addresses. So life has changed and changed for the better. Trust me, that is one thing that's changed for the better, having 911 addresses.
That's
And
right.
you talk about out in the country, farm accidents, logging and stuff. And one of the big problem was, even if you could get to a phone, was given those directions. And then also think about the directions were going through a dispatcher to the officer. I mean, it was going through several different people, and the mistakes or the omissions, they happened and made
Yeah.
it very difficult.
Yeah. When you back where I grew up, I was on Rural Route 4. I don't even think I had a box number. It was just Rural Route 4. So, like, there was like three of us on Rural Route 4.
Okay.
So, but back when I was growing up, there for farm accidents and things like that, there was a lot going on, injuries with the machinery, silos when you're filling a
Mm-hmm.
silo. If you fall in that, you're gonna be gone. You have injuries with livestock, and so there's a lot of stuff going on, and the remoteness keeps you away from access from that emergency care. So you're really dependent on the community you live with, your family, and that kind of thing. Can you talk about any accidents or things that you remember growing up in farm country?
Well, I remember one pretty good myself back in the 90s. I'll show people, and truly farm accidents, occupational accidents, well, any accidents, even at home, they happen so quickly. And we were chopping corn silage. We had upright silos on the dairy farm I grew up in. And literally, I had shut all the equipment off, and one of the PTOs was still spinning, even though the tractor was cut off, and I slipped and fell, and my hand hit the guard. And this was a guarded PTO. I mean, we had the guards on there like you're supposed to, but my finger went down the grease fitting hole. Just accident, and it happened. And now we were very fortunate. We have a local hospital that's only about 6-7 miles away, so I could drive myself. Now and of course, I'm a big proponent. We got to keep our local hospitals in rural areas, if for no other reason, to have that ER close.
Yes. Wait a second. Back up, John. Did you
Yeah.
just say you drove yourself to town?
Well, yeah, sure did. Yeah.
So you took off your finger. What did you do? Like wrap it
Well,
up?
I had a bandana, and I picked up the loose part, and I'll tell this funny story. I'll try to make it quick because I don't want to keep everybody. But okay, when you're missing a finger, You didn't stop at the front desk to check in. I just walked right past that desk and went to the back trying to find a doctor or a nurse. Well, I don't want to throw her under the bus, but the first nurse I came to was actually a young lady that I had gone to high school with. And I'm just going to use the name Cindy because I don't want. And I said, Cindy, I cut my finger off. Well, I don't think she heard the whole thing. I think she heard cut finger. So when she opened it up and looked at it, she passed out. So I got a passed out nurse in one arm and a bloody hand on this, and one bleeding like you would think, but we'll talk about that later. And a bloody hand here, and I'm shaking her. I'm going, Cindy. She comes to, and I said, Cindy, I know you've seen worse than this in the ER. And she goes, well, this is my first day and I know you. And let me tell you, and trust me, I don't want the viewers to think my local hospital is a very good hospital, but the story even gets funnier. We get back here with the doctor. He looks at it and he says, son, the best thing I can do for you is we really just need to sew it up. He said, if I put it back on, it's going to hurt you for the rest of your life. And so I said, okay, that sounds logical. Well, he's grinding down the bone so he could sew it up. And I finally said, Doc, you got to stop. He said, what's wrong? I said, it's hurting so bad, I'm about ready to punch you. And he said, well, son, ain't that morphine shot kicking in yet? And the other nurse goes, oh my God, we forgot. And I
My
didn't even, I didn't even
gracious.
have a morphine shot and they were grinding on the bone. So
Isn't
anyway,
that
that
amazing?
was my farm accident experience.
Well,
But no,
John,
trust me,
you're
that's a
tough as
funny
nails,
story.
John. You're
Yeah.
tough as nails.
But our hospital is wonderful. And that was just a funny experience and just, kind of a calamity of things happening.
Well, and I think for the audience too, I just want to put into context when you've got like 15 to 20% of Americans living remotely and there is an emergency, what you said about how things happen so fast, you do not have 1 second to spare to think. And we're talking about farm families have children, lots of many in the old days when you and I were young, there were lots of children and families. Injuries were frequent not because people weren't trying to be safe or they were neglectful, but because you're working around livestock, machinery, silos, and in an instant that stuff can happen so fast. And so when you're in a city, and my husband's in the building trades and he's in manufacturing and countertops and things like that. When an accident happens on building a house or a commercial building in a downtown city, if someone takes if someone takes a hand off in a saw, you can get that person into a hospital fast. That doesn't mean that there isn't a wait in those waiting rooms, because believe me, we all know there's emergency room waits. But hopefully they're triaging people quickly and so that people can work with those kinds of injuries quickly. 1,500 acres in a tractor. That's a whole different thing. And you and I know I've told you before about like my grandfather back in the 1940s, back injury with a manure spreader, crawled 300 yards through the mud to the house. No radios and tractors in the 40s. Uh, I think the wife was in town, Granny was in town, get with the kids, and Grandpa had to do that broken back. So, like, I think we gotta keep some context here for how this is for rural. And again, like you say, I remember too when there were accidents just in the area, car accidents, getting a finger lopped off, it was jumping in the car, getting a bag of ice and running into town, 12 miles, 20 miles to the hospital. That's how we responded. So, is there any other little stories about that?
Not personal stories. I'll give you a little bit of my history and stuff in the early 2000s. Let me tell you how new 911 addressing is for rural America. I was on board of supervisors in the early 2000s, and we were just I wouldn't say finishing up, but we were just getting into the meat of getting everything 911 addressed. And we
Yes.
had some basic stuff done in the 90s, but not the individual houses. So, I mean, these kids and, the younger generation probably thinks it's been around forever, but no, it's the late 90s, early 2000. And you came across a great article talking about 911. Uh, it's just
Yeah.
wonderful about the history of it.
Yeah, and, should we why don't we dive into that really quick? Because I think people don't realize that, 911, I think it started in was it Haley'sville, Alabama?
Alabama.
Haley'sville do I have the name right, John? Is it Haley'sville,
Yes, I
Alabama?
think so.
Haley'sville, Alabama is northwest of Birmingham in a rural area. Today, I think their population is around 4,000, and this is 1968, and they're the first community in the nation that offers a 911 service in 1968. And that comes out of an earlier, request from, the Firefighters of America. They had, in the 1950s, had requested providing a national phone number for emergencies related to fires. And so, then Haley'sville, Alabama
Alabama.
picks this up, says, "We gotta do this for our area." When we think about it, John, these rural communities really are dependent on radio communication at the time back in the '60s and the '70s. CB radios, police scanner radios, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff was important for rural, remote people. And so in 1968, you've got Haley'sville. It takes more than 30 years because in 1999, that's when the FCC gets behind a national 911 number. So it takes that long
That
just to bring
doesn't
it
that
around.
that almost seems amazing of why. And let's tell the youngsters here that might hear, before, if you had emergency, you had to call the operator. Remember? You had to dial 0 and you had to ask for the fire department. You had to ask for the fire department, and then it had to get transferred and all that, and, that was the way it was before, and
Yeah.
911.
Yeah. Well, that gets into this little area that I wanted to talk about, which is so interesting to me, was what was going on in the years before 911? How did your community, John, work together to respond to f- um, a barn fire? Like when the barn starts on fire and it's going to burn down, and you got to get cows out, and all the hay's gone for the year. Or, for example, when someone's injured in the field or in coal country. And coal country has some of their own emergency responders right
Yes.
there on
We
site.
we we probably let me tell you, I live in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, and that's in Wise County, and we're in the Virginia coal fields, so we border Kentucky. We probably have, for a rural county, more infrastructure for emergency services because of the coal industry, and they did have their own mine rescue and everything, and then they also had, most of these companies had, a two-way radio, high frequency that really went out. This is before cell phones and stuff, so they had a lot of communications. But now, I live on the end of the county that's had a little bit of agriculture. Grew up on a dairy farm and stuff. And one thing, and when I talk about Wise County, we're not really a real rural area. The population right currently is about 45,000. So I mean, that compared to a lot of Midwestern counties, that's a lot. But we still are entirely 100% on volunteer ambulance and volunteer fire departments. We
Yeah,
have no paid departments within the county. So these volunteers are essential.
that's right.
Well, they are our EMS. That's it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And they're amazing. They're
Oh, yeah.
amazing. So before we had these services, how did rural communities here organize to respond to emergencies?
Well, they formed or
They
local.
formed though.
Yeah,
They
they
formed.
formed them.
Okay.
It was a lot of back in the day. I can remember some of the old timers that would come by the farm talking about how they'd raise money, the bake sales, the bingo. Bingo was a big thing about raising money to buy a fire truck or to buy ambulance for the
Yes.
volunteer ambulance service.
Yes.
Potluck dinners, and then, of course, a lot of times it was tied into a lot of church activities,
That's right.
raising funds
That's
for the
right.
local ambulance service, and that's still today is a big part. Bingo's just down the road 6 miles, or my closest Easton. I'm gonna throw out a shout out, Easton Gap or Valley Fire Department. They do bingo every week,
Yeah.
and that's part
Yeah.
of their fundraising.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was a kid, I think it was probably like in the late '70s, and this is out in rural Iowa on the border with Minnesota. So I'm sure Minnesota was doing the same thing. But there was an effort statewide, probably came from the state, maybe supported by tax dollars, where rural communities aligned with church parishes could identify one or two, not one or two, two to four volunteers in a church parish who neighbors could call on in an emergency. So, for example, in my church parish, I think there were 4 or 5 people that went through this training in the church basement. CPR, tourniquets, heart attack, identifying things like blood sugars that, is this a heart attack or is it diabetic? That kind of stuff. And so like because the neighbors lived right beside each other, so if someone got their finger lopped off in the auger or whatever, you would call your the one of those volunteers first, and she would have an emergency aid kit that she could use out there in the field. And then someone would also be radioing into the sheriff. And then you would run into the same issues that you talk about. You got to turn right at the Locust Church, and it's pavement for 3 miles, and then you're gonna hit gravel. You're gonna go around the corner, and there's a farmhouse on your left, but you're gonna go right. And so it was all of that kind of stuff. And the new sheriffs coming in, you have to know every nook and cranny, but that takes time. So anyway, so we did a training, and it was an organized training, and there were 2 or 3 women in our community that had the first aid responder kits that would be on site. And the other thing I was going to say, that this is a little bit interesting, that in middle school, all us students had to go through tourniquet training.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we did that through hunter safety. I can remember doing that in hunter safety class. Just
Yeah.
afraid we were gonna shoot each other.
And it's interesting too because like as children, I don't remember feeling offended by that or grossed out or afraid of it. I felt like I was just getting taught something very practical, because if there is an emergency or a car accident and there's an artery in the leg that got hit, you can tie that off. And I just felt it was practical. So, for a 12-year-old kid to tie a tourniquet, that could save your life. So, we were also kind of wanted to talk a few minutes about what's going on for rural communities today. What does it cost to have a 911 service? How do counties fund this stuff? Where does this come out of? It's related to the government, the FCC, but then states have their own taxing that's going in to help support these things.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of my background. I mentioned a little bit earlier about being on board of supervisors. We had a 911 center. Of course, that's funded. It was back then. I don't think it's changed since then. Within the sheriff's department. So funding for that either, and it was a mix of federal, state, and local dollars
Right.
that went into like the 911 center. And then some of that money, I can remember they added it was a small, like a cell phone tax that was on your cell phone tax bill that went into 911 or telephone. Of course, now nobody has a hardline telephone; it's all cell phones. But they did put a small tax. When I say small tax, maybe I can remember back in the day about $2.50 on your phone bill. You'd see a 911 tax, and that went to fund 911 services. But now what's still in rural America still is not funded very well, does not get many state or federal funds or local fund, is our volunteer EMS. They still do a lot of fundraising themselves. And
Yeah.
yeah, I can remember on our county budget, of course, everybody knows education's the biggest part of our local county budget. The sheriff law enforcement was the second. And I mean, we gave a little bit. There was a little bit left over we gave to volunteer agencies, EMS, fire and rescue.
So I just want to point to a county out in Iowa right now. I just want to read you something and ask you, how do we fix this, John? We're talking about a county out in Iowa that says that their upcoming budget includes $546,000 in total expenses, and they have a revenue coming in of 351,000. So that's like 350, 455. That's almost a $200,000 in the red
Yeah,
operation
deficit.
expense. And then later he talks about how legislators, and this is in Iowa, the legislators in Iowa had looked at adding an additional phone surcharge to cover these gaps in funding for 911 and emergency responders. And the legislators in Iowa said that they considered that a tax on the people and it wasn't approved. So those extra dollars that they were going to add to people's phone surcharges were not approved. And so we're in a $200,000 in the red operation budget for this one county in Iowa. Tell me, if we're trying to fund 911 and emergency responders and we're in the red and a lot of our responders are volunteer,
Mhm.
how does this add up? Where does this add up?
Well, and this is the direct part that affects us here rural, part of the healthcare crisis we're facing in rural America in general.
Yeah.
And, the funding part, put this way, every department, whether it be law enforcement, education, everybody say, "Oh, we don't get enough." And okay, that might be true. But let me tell you one aspect that definitely does not get enough and never has, don't even come close, is the rural volunteer EMS services. And for years, rural America has benefited from a lot of hardworking volunteers that's given their free time and a lot of their effort to raise money locally, and they're going to struggle. And a lot of them have gone to Medicaid reimbursement. They put in billing departments to try to bill insurances. My biggest fear, and most of them are talking about their biggest fear, is if those reimbursements get cut, they're already struggling. And yeah,
Right.
but they were trying to answer that question on funding by doing reimbursement, by charging insurances, by charging Medicaid or Medicare. And I know they've done that here locally, here in Wise County. And like I say, but if they're looking at funding cuts there, I don't know where they turn.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, these things are expensive to maintain. I think that the FCC is requiring counties to buy the radios
Mhm.
that cost, and I think they're required to buy them every maybe 2 years or 5 years, and but probably changes per state, but a single radio for a county costs $70,000. And and so, like, that kind of thing is, and you and I know that when the accident happens out in farm country, you don't have minutes, you have seconds to respond to that. You need that radio responder. You need your volunteers, you need your neighbors there to help you out within seconds. And so, is this a priority for voters? And then also, is there something, when you look at our tax bases are so much, there's such a lighter population concentration in rural areas. We do not have the tax base that metropolitan areas have. There, and also considering that metropolitan areas often benefit from the agricultural products and raw goods that come out of rural areas, maybe urban areas could actually put a tax that would then support
Well,
volunteer EMTs.
At the very least, I'm gonna speak for Virginia because I don't know how everybody's set up like in Iowa and stuff. The state of Virginia needs to do more funding for rural EMS, period, because the locality cannot afford to do it, and these rural organizations are already stretched too thin to
Yes.
do it. So at the very least, we got to look at the state to provide more funding for rural EMS, just across the board, because it's part of our emergency services. And here's another thing we're having rural America, many places that our population is declining, but we're getting older. The average age is getting older. So healthcare services and those rural EMS services are even more important to us as we're getting older.
Yeah.
So,
Another thing that folks have to understand, in if you're in an urban place and you vacation in rural places and you are out on a bike trail and you call 911, how does that get through to you out there on the bike trail? Or if you're out kayaking or canoeing. And to understand that, like, our taxes pay for that system that transfers your call to where you're at. So maybe you're in Richmond, you live in Richmond, but you're coming out here to ride the New River Trail with your bike. And you're out there and you go over your handlebars and you get a head injury. And when you wake up, you call 911. Well, you are dependent on the dispatch for this area, not Richmond, this area. So if you want a vacation here, you really should think about transferring that tax base
Supporting, yeah,
from
supporting
Richmond.
legislation, yep, that helps
We
us.
need that tax base to support our emergency responders. So if when you're out here, if you're injured, that's a reliable service that you can count on.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do this last plug for rural EMS. If there's ever a group of people that stretch your tax dollars the most and put it to the best use, it's rural volunteer EMS, and
Yes.
I'll stand by that statement. I mean, they do.
And before we cut off, I gotta just tell you, last year we were driving on the from the mountains through South Carolina, through North Carolina to Galax, Virginia. Here, it was December 26th. It was 10 o'clock at night, and we're on a mountain road, and we're driving the speed limit. And the car in front of us slams on their brakes to make a turn. We slam on our brakes. We miss them and the kid behind us didn't. He went into oncoming traffic to avoid colliding with our vehicle. An oncoming car, mountain roads, oncoming car went off her road. Those EMS people down there, and you know what? If I'll re-record the name of this EMS because I really want to give them a shout out because they were amazing. Is it Morganton or Morgantown, North Carolina?
Oh, I think it's Morgantown.
Morgantown, just south of Morgantown. Those EMS were there in minutes on December 26th. They had tow trucks, ambulances, and police. The sheriff was there, and those people got us sorted out and on our way safe at 10:30 at night on December 26th. So God bless the Morgantown, and it's the rural ones south of Morgantown, the EMS there too. Those units, they were the ones out there within minutes of that accident. So, and they're
Yep.
volunteer.
And God bless all the rural EMS volunteers because let me tell you, and it's so much a family tradition for some of them. They'll talk about their dad, their granddad was a member of the ambulance service and the volunteer fire department. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. John, this has been a really great conversation, and I really hope that some of the audience out there takes this to heart because this stuff is really important. Even if you live in a city, it's important to support these local emergency systems in rural areas and the emergency responders.
sure will. Well, thanks for coming on board again, and until next time,
Thank you so much, John. We'll see you soon.
talk to you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.